So, Namco was a beloved arcade game manufacturer, but what was their first original game for home systems? I don't mean their first game for home systems in general, that would be their port of Pac-Man for the MSX. What I mean to ask is, what's their first original game for home systems that isn't just a port of one of their arcade games? Well, it's kind of complicated and debated. In 1985, they released 3 games for the Famicom that could be considered the first. The first 2 of which are both their only Famicom games related to arcade games made for their really early 8080 CPU-based arcade hardware that predates Galaxia. The first of these is Warpman, which is either considered a sequel or remake of their 1981 arcade game Warp and Warp. It's debated. The same situation applies to their game Battle City, released a few months later, which is either considered a sequel or remake to their 1980 arcade game Tank Battalion. But I think the less controversial answer would be their game Starluster, released towards the end of 1985, which was an original concept for them. But personally, I do actually consider Warpman to be their first original home game, as it's unique enough to set itself apart from Warp and Warp. I mean, it has a different title for a reason. But these games are actually far more interesting outside of their debated status as sequels or ports. Warp and Warp was initially released in Japan in July 1981. For context, between their initial releases of New Rally X and Galaga. It was the last game they released on their 8080 based hardware. It's a deceptively simple game. You play as this character who must eliminate the aliens called Bero Bero. The main gimmick of the game is that at certain intervals you can warp between 2 worlds. The main world is just a simple square where you can walk around and shoot the Bero Beros, who, as they get closer to the middle of the screen, change color and increase in point value. At the center of the screen is the portal between the worlds. If you step in the middle of it while the bars around it are flashing with the word warp, you get transported to the other world. The other world being this maze world, which also has a portal so you can warp back. In the maze world, the gameplay changes so that you no longer shoot the aliens, but rather bomb them in a maze. Yes, it's basically the gameplay of Bomberman, albeit incredibly simplified, and this game actually predates the release of the original MSX Bomberman game in 1983 by nearly 2 years. The Famicom game follows the same basic template, though the criteria needed to warp is different, and warping actually lets you access different power-ups between worlds. Plus, there's new enemies. But it also includes 2-player co-op, which automatically makes the game better. In fact, I would recommend it, but there's one major problem with the game. There really isn't a good reason to warp, and you might as well stick to the default world. The gameplay is just better there, because if you want to do the bombing stuff, you're better off just turning off the game and playing a Bomberman game instead. Even then, the gameplay in the default world is so mind-numbingly basic, and this is coming from someone who loves games like this. The game never forces you to warp, and the special weapons gained from warping in the Famicom game just aren't really worth it as you lose them between rounds anyways, and they can literally hurt you. But if the game looks appealing to you, I'd say give it a shot. But if you want a much better experience where you brain deadly roam around shooting things, then I think Namco's Tank Battalion games serve that purpose much better. Okay, not the original Tank Battalion, which also released on that 8080 based arcade hardware. It's quite rough and janky and hasn't aged well. But I definitely recommend its 2 sequels, Tank Force and Battle City, if you haven't played it already. Battle City is probably the console game with the widest gap between people who experienced it through pirated versions and people who played it officially. It's probably the most famously pirated console game, as it's far more famous for being widely pirated than anything else about it. Despite initially only releasing in Japan, there are tons of pirated NES versions, loads of releases on multi-carts, and if you're from a country where Nintendo never officially released or licensed the release of the Famicom or NES, but you were able to play Famicom games anyways, it's probably 95% likely you've played this game. It's unfortunate that this is all it's remembered for, as Battle City is easily one of the best single-screen arcade games on the system, and dare I say, one of the top 10 games on it. It's one of those classic, simple arcade games that stands the test of time. Yes, I know I'm praising a game that looks like this, as if it's a work of high art, but I don't care. Like Tank Battalion, which I didn't describe much about earlier, you play as a tank shooting down enemy tanks and environmental obstacles while attempting to protect your emblem at the bottom. Just like Warpman though, Battle City improves on its arcade predecessor with the addition of power-ups, new enemies, and co-op multiplayer. But not only that, it allows you to design your own levels. It was ported onto the Game Boy in 1991 by the company Nova rather than Namco, once again being Japan exclusive for some unknowable godforsaken reason, but it's not worth playing these days compared to the Famicom version, especially since it lacks the level editor. But there was a third game in the series released a few months after the Game Boy port of Battle City in December of 1991 in arcades, that game being Tank Force. This is yet another evolution on the gameplay that I highly recommend, though since it's an arcade game, it lacks the fun level editor of its predecessor. Unfortunately, outside of this trilogy, there aren't really any other Tank Battalion games. While Namco does use the Tank Battalion and Battle City names for newer projects, none of these games actually play like the original Tank Battalion games. They're just completely different styled games involving tanks. But hey, Battle City and Tank Force are incredible, so I can't be upset. As for the less divisive pick for the title of first original Namco home game, Starluster, it's a very impenetrable space combat simulation game whose complex systems I can't really wrap my head around, which was actually a huge point of criticism back when the game initially released, but it's considered a cult classic now. But there is one interesting thing I can say about it at least. It is the game that established Namco's UGSF series, a continuity of various sci-fi themed Namco games that are all connected to each other. Okay, technically the first UGSF game was Galaxian, but Starluster established the interconnectivity between these games. I'm not going to get into the full mess of that here, as this section has already gone on long enough, and there's just too many issues with it or interesting things regarding it to talk about, so I'll just leave you with this. Dig Dug got a divorce. Anyways, in the game, the bases from Namco's earlier 1981 arcade game Bosconian make appearances. Following this, in 1987's Galaga 88, a sequel to Galaga, a Bosconian base can be seen in the background of a set of stages, and in 1989 and 1990 respectively, Bosconian would receive two sequels in the form of Blast Off in arcades and Final Blaster for the PC Engine. In 1990, Namco would debut the concept of the series' titular UGSF, or United Galaxy Space Force, in Galaxian 3, or Galaxian to the Power of 3. Man, if only there was a shorthand for that, which is its own weird thing, and this is probably where I should stop. But speaking of the UGSF, let's close out this section by talking about Warpman again, because I found this YouTube user copy and paste this exact same comment on at least 3 separate videos of Warpman, claiming that the 2 playable characters in Warpman are the main characters from Baraduke, aka the game Metroid took a lot of its Lambuxwacious inspiration from. Those characters being Tacky and Kissy, aka the divorced mother of Dig Dug's 3 children. No, I'm not making this up. If that's the case, that should mean Warpman is canon to the UGSF series, but it's not listed on the UGSF website, though it's far from the only game missing from the website's timeline. But I've looked everywhere and I couldn't find anything mentioning this. It's not in the game itself, its manual, the Namco Collection's website's description of the game, or even the issue of Namco's NG magazine promoting it when it released. It seems to me that both characters are just Warpman. The reason I kind of want to believe this claim though is that Warpman released the same month as Baraduke in July of 1985, so I feel like it would make sense for Namco to try to do some cross promotion this way. And the second player character's suit has the same color scheme as the suits from Baraduke. But whatever, I could go on about these classic Namco games forever. Like, how many of you even knew that the characters from Mappy didn't actually originate from the game, but rather were initially created for robot toys by Namco? But if you take anything out of this section, Battle City and Tank Force are incredible simple arcade-style games and deserve more love. So, while the name Sonic Team was first used for a group of developers in Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic Team's origins really date back to Sega's RPG Phantasy Star, released in 1987, as 3 people who would go on to form the original Sonic Team, those people being Sonic's creator Naoto Oshima, programmer for both games Yuji Naka, and the late great artist Rieko Kodama, worked on that game. But aside from Phantasy Star's direct sequel, there was another proto-Sonic Team game, that being the 1990 Mega Drive roguelike RPG Fatal Labyrinth. This was seemingly the first collaboration between the aforementioned Naoto Oshima and Sonic director and game designer Hirokazu Yasuhara to be released, seemingly while they were working on Sonic. Oshima was one of the artists responsible for the game's graphics while Yasuhara designed the game. I'm going to make a bold statement here and say that this is likely the first roguelike game for consoles. While games like 1982's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons for the Intellivision and 1989's Dragon Buster 2 by Namco for the Famicom released prior and had elements of roguelikes in them, they were missing a lot of the mechanics that make up a roguelike. So I think Fatal Labyrinth was the first console game that could truly be called one. But Fatal Labyrinth didn't just exist in isolation. 1 month after its initial November 1990 release, Dragon Crystal released for the Game Gear in December, making it the first RPG for the system actually. It's sort of a companion game to Fatal Labyrinth, reusing some of its assets. Weirdly though, neither Yasuhara or Oshima are credited with its development, but because of the similar game systems and shared graphics between it and Fatal Labyrinth, I'm sure they worked on it. It also received a port to the Master System in 1991. But I guess I should go deeper into explaining each game. Fatal Labyrinth was initially released in Japan as Shi no Meikyu Labyrinth of Deaths exclusively for the Sega game Toshokan online service. It never received a cartridge release in Japan, but heavily updated localized cartridge releases would arrive in other territories in 1991. The plot is extremely basic. A bunch of bad guys stole the Holy Goblet for a dragon, so you must traverse 30 levels of their tower to retrieve it. The gameplay is also pretty much what you'd expect if you have ever played a real RPG roguelike before, with randomly generated dungeons, cursed items, bump style but snappy turn-based combat, and a promotion-based leveling system. The game does allow you to continue at the state in which you started at the beginning of the floor you died on if you made it to the 5th floor though. Gold also only serves one purpose, and that's to make your funeral on the game over screen fancier. It's a pretty good time if you like these kinds of games. In Dragon Crystal, you play as a kid who tripped and fell inside of a crystal ball, and so you must escape the mazes inside. The main thing setting it apart from Fatal Labyrinth is the pet raising mechanic, with you raising this pet who follows you around. It's mainly meant to indicate your level. I didn't get very far in this footage, but yeah, this little egg thing can turn into a dragon. The Game Gear and Master System versions are basically the same, with the most notable difference being the different visuals for the mazes. And yeah, the visual design of the mazes here is kind of ugly. The music is also different between the two versions, and I have to say, the music in all three of these games is good, but considering what these games are, it is way too repetitive. These are definitely games you should play while listening to something else, because you don't really need to devote any auditory attention to these games. I think the game is honestly more suited to the handheld format of the Game Gear rather than the Master System, but that version isn't bad by any means. One minor issue I have with this game is that you need to pull up a menu to see any of your stats besides HP on the fly, and I felt they could have dedicated a little more screen space to that stuff, even with the small resolution of the Game Gear. Between the two games, while I do think this style of gameplay is perfect for a game on the go, I prefer Fatal Labyrinth, as while it is a little more generic, it's a much more refined game, and if you like to turn your brain off and just let yourself be taken on a ride by a roguelike, I highly recommend it. It's been re-released numerous times, notably on Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, which is how I first played it. Though Dragon Crystal hasn't as much, though it did get a sequel for mobile phones in 2003. Despite all of Fatal Labyrinth's re-releases though, the game is still pretty overlooked, especially its development history, and I haven't really found any interviews or anything where the two Sonic Team co-founders discussed working on it. Playing this game doesn't really offer you any insight into their game design mindsets regarding Sonic, but they're two completely different types of games anyways. I will say though, RPGs seem to be a lot of these people's bread and butter before they created Sonic. All that being said, Fatal Labyrinth and Dragon Crystal are cool. Check them out. So, this series is called Video Game Obscurities, not just obscure video games, so why not talk about something obscure that isn't a game itself? I've always been fascinated by official system libraries and the differences between them in each region. And I'm not just talking about the base level interest in Japanese stuff that a lot of people, including myself, have. No, I'm also interested in stuff like the NES's really weird PAL region library in chronology, which I honestly might go more in depth on some other time. That's not a promise though. I'm also interested in stuff like which games for what systems only released in Japan and PAL regions. Parodius Da was released for consumer systems in both Japan and PAL regions 5 times in the 1990s, and not a single one of those times did it ever make its way to the United States, where I live. Oh crap, I just doxed myself. One thing I've noticed is that console libraries in the West tend to have way less games than Japanese libraries, even if the systems were fairly popular everywhere. Like, the NES and SNES both have libraries of over 600 and 700 games respectively in North America, while the Famicom and Super Famicom have nearly double that amount in Japan. The original PlayStation also has one of the most infamously large video game libraries of all time, but in both North America and Europe, it only has around 1,400 games. while in Japan it has way over double that. Of course, Sega's Master System and Mega Drive/Genesis basically have the complete opposite situation going on, since they were both way more popular outside of Japan, something that I've talked about before. Same with the N64. Half of the Genesis and N64's games weren't even released in Japan, while only 82 games were released for the Master System or Mark III in Japan. Nearly 1/3 of what the rest of the world got. Okay, technically 83, but one wasn't a commercial release. I've actually played every Japanese Master System game through means, and it's the largest full system library I've ever played. Okay, technically, since a few of those games require peripherals, I didn't play them all, but I have checked them all out. It's a shockingly good and diverse library for one handled almost entirely by one company. The only other full system libraries I've checked out were the Super Graphics, Virtual Boy, and 32X, and in those last two cases, there were the complete international libraries. I don't even own any of these. Unfortunately, so many other people have made videos about all of these libraries, so I don't really have any exclusive videos to bring you about them. I can only expose them to you in bits and chunks. But another thing that's interesting about regional libraries is that it's usually easier to follow the Japanese releases in the 20th century chronologically, as most Japanese companies actually kept track of their release dates, while everywhere else, software was just distributed when it was ready with no set release dates, and setting release dates wouldn't really catch on until the mid-90s. Once you get to the mid-2000s and digital distribution though, this stuff gets way harder to keep track of, and what counts gets harder and harder to define. With the current systems, it's not even remotely possible. That being said, another thing I'm interested in regarding system libraries is statistics. Like, which game system has the least diverse install base? By that, I mean which system's highest selling games number of sales match up closest to the system's total sales. It seems to be the Wii, with Wii Sports selling 82.9 million copies and the Wii itself selling 101.63 million. So if you own a Wii, it's nearly 82% likely you own Wii Sports. Meanwhile, the biggest difference seems to be with the Sega Game Gear, with its highest selling game being reported to be Sonic the Hedgehog 2, with a measly 400,000 units sold. Meanwhile, the system itself was reported as selling 10.62 million units in a 1996 issue of Famitsu, meaning less than 5% of people who own the system own its best-selling game. And so it has the most diverse install base of any discontinued system. Yeah, I think these numbers are probably a bunch of baloney. I think the Famitsu number is accurate, but the sales figure for Sonic 2 comes from the 2016 edition of Guinness World Records Gamer Edition. And given how those books usually fail to even remotely hit the dartboard itself in terms of accuracy, this is probably a hunk of crap. I want you to keep in mind that these sales stats for video games are almost never actually correct anyways, and I'm very likely to mess some stuff up here myself, so take this all with a grain of salt. This is all just for fun. But back to the differences between libraries in different regions, which system has the poorest international support? As in the least amount of games that released in all three major regions, those being North America, Europe, and Japan. Obviously, I need to set up some parameters regarding this statistic. Obviously, the system itself had to have released in all three major regions, so systems that only released in one or two obviously don't count, because of course they have much worse international support from not being released at all in certain regions. But I'm also not sure what to count as having the best international support. since some systems don't even have any regional barriers for games. But from what I could tell, the system that released in all major regions with the worst international support is the Game Boy Color. Only 79 of its total 915 games were released in all 3 major regions. That's only 8% of its total library. Guess I gotta play the entire internationally shared Game Boy Color library now, huh? Anyways, I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you haven't seen it yet, check out my previous video game Obscurities video. And while you're at it, if you want to hear about another great obscure game, check out my review of Ginga Fukai Densetsu Sapphire. I have both on screen right now. I'm very grateful for all my patrons. I can't express it enough, and thank you all for watching. Have a good one, whatever one is.